You're listening to The Crypt, and joining me on the show today is Dacre Stoker, who is the great-grandnephew of Irish author Bram Stoker, who penned the 1897 Gothic novel Dracula. And Dacre is here today to talk all about the man who brought us one of the most famous novels of all time. So you're very welcome to the show, Dacre.
Rita, thank you so much. I'm speaking to you from South Carolina. It's rather chilly here, but nothing like the Crypt, I'm sure, as chilly as it is there.
Very true. We're not known for the good weather in Ireland. Well, Bram Stoker is one of Dublin's sons of literature who was born in Clontarf. So could you first tell us about his childhood there?
Well, he was. He was born in Clontarf. They didn't live all that long, in the household until I think Bram was 2 years old when they moved to Artane. The family obviously had been there earlier. But, it was a nice house on the Crescent, and he was close to the water. And, unfortunately, during those years that he was there, they were sickly years for him. So as we did the research to find out that not only was Bram a sickly young boy, but he was brought up in a time, born in Black 47, when there was all sorts of difficult times for the people of Ireland, just getting over the potato famine and the cholera epidemics. And so there was a lot of sickness and poverty. So I just imagine this young boy growing up, not well himself in his surroundings, which sadly turned out to be perfect for a man to write such horrifying Gothic literature of people almost wandering around dead or undead during these very difficult times. So I feel that upbringing had a big influence on his psyche that came out much later on in life.
And I believe his mum used to read horror novels to him.
Well, we know for a fact that she was brought up during the cholera epidemic in Sligo, 50 years earlier than that. And so the stories that she actually told him, besides some of the Irish famous stories of mythology of vampires and banshees and goblins and things, were actually first-hand stories that she told of her horrifying time with this cholera epidemic. And the irony is, Rita, is that nowadays, right now, we're living through the scare of Ebola in our world and how it's being passed on from person to person. Of course, with air travel, it makes it worse. But in those days, the cholera was the same. Poor people in Sligo had no idea how these diseases were being communicated. And one of the stories that we actually saw, notes that were left by Charlotte, that she told her young son, who was sickly and in bed and never sure if he was going to live to breathe another day, that of this person who was near death, and the husband left the home with his poor sickly wife, and he wasn't sure if she was going to be taken out because of her illness and thrown into the communal grave. So he wrapped a red rag around her leg so he could identify her in the grave. And sure enough, he comes home and she's gone. So he goes to the community grave and he finds her lying in there in a pile of bodies, and he goes to pay his last respects. And as he does, he finds out the dear lady's still alive. And so he pulls her out, and she didn't have the cholera. She had some other illness. And of course, she survived. Now, imagine Bram hearing that of a person who is misdiagnosed and prematurely partially buried and being dragged out of the grave. I'm sure that all these things weighed heavily on this young man's imagination and came out to contribute to the undead of Dracula years later.
And then when he was older then, he went to Trinity College and worked in Dublin Castle as well. Could you tell us a bit about that time period in his life?
The remarkable recovery, first of all, needs to be noted, in that somehow at the age of 7, when he moved inland a little bit, and just for some medical reason, we think it had to do with some of his uncles who were doctors and possibly bloodlet them. So he recovered and he became a strong young man. And I think through sport and his perseverance and his tutoring, he became a well-rounded young man who was then allowed to enter into Trinity, where he became one of the big men of the campus, both in the Phil and the Hist, in the debating societies, and in the sports field. He just blossomed into a very special young man. But at the same time, he also had to work in Dublin Castle because his father retired, and as his dad retired, the one son who was not going to medical school needed to be the breadwinner for the family. So Bram not only did his studies and his sports, he also was a clerk in the petty sessions system in Dublin Castle. And that was remarkable in itself because in typical Bram form, he really bared down and did all these sort of law crunching, and he realized there was a big gap in the way the judicial system worked. So when he became the inspector, he actually wrote a book, and the book was, of course, entitled The Duties of the Clerks of Petty Sessions, and that book was in use up until the 60s to show other clerks of petty sessions how they're supposed to do their job. So here is the organized, somewhat anal Bram Stoker making sure that the judicial system in Ireland for petty sessions worked, and then later on became the horror writer as well. So you could say maybe it's two forms of horror a little bit.
I believe you have a theory as to the connection between his character Jonathan Harker in Dracula and his time working in Dublin Castle.
I do. I mean, I think there's so many similarities between a man who's sort of confined to a castle. Bram was a very creative young man, and he was not able to do what he really wanted to do. He had to do this job. He had to be a clerk to fulfill the sort of the needs of the family and make the money. But he really wanted to be writing and doing theater work. He ended up sort of sneaking off on the side and doing these pro bono literary reviews, which got him into the theaters and got him into his creative side was sort of working at that point, but he didn't get credited with his name, and partly because we don't think his father really approved of all that, but it was the inner Bram sort of beginning to sort of come out, that writer, the theatrical side, which was trying to come out. And much like Harker, when Bram was promoted to the inspector, he needed to travel around Ireland, sort of, as we say, a stranger in strange land, to go and make sure other inspectors were doing their thing. And he probably wasn't always, accepted all that well when a young man comes into town telling other clerks how to work, much like Jonathan Harker traveling by train all the way over through Munich and Bucharest and get into Romania and having to conduct business with Dracula. So I'm sure there's a lot of sort of autobiographical work going there when you compare Bram and Harker himself.
Well, as you said there, writing was his true passion, and he spent some time as a freelance journalist. Could you talk about how this led to his friendship with actor Henry Irving, and how that friendship was the catalyst to change the course of Stoker's life?
You're right, Rita. It absolutely was, and it was. I'm sure there was. You could say there's some fate, but writing a theatre review for one night when Irving was president in Dublin, and he wrote this favorable review. And of course, Irving, being the showman, but also having a bit of an ego, read this review and it said, "Oh, this is a pretty glowing review. I need to meet the man who's so wise to write such a review." And so he invites him to the Shelburne Hotel, where he has dinner with them. And there's plenty of accounts of what Bram says in his book about Irving. These two souls kind of came together, and bared souls, and almost to the point of hysterics, that Bram really understood that this man understood him, and Irving understood Bram. And I believe that both of them realized that the two of them together made a complete type of person, that the organized, the lawyer type, the number cruncher, the solid Bram, and the super creative Irving, together they could take on the theater world. And one of Bram's plans that was completely gelled with Irving's was that they wanted to raise the respectability and the profile of the theater in society, and that Bram was going to prove his father wrong, and Bram and Irving could do it together, and they certainly did. As we all know, this union created the first actor who was knighted and created a long and illustrious career in the headlines for Irving, and Bram was very happy to be behind him in the shadows, so to speak, which also allowed him to fulfill his writing career when he was in London.
And then he married actress Florence Balcombe. She'd also attracted the attention of Oscar Wilde. Could you talk a bit about that?
Certainly. I mean, isn't that interesting? I mean, it was obviously a small world at the time, but Oscar obviously had her attention. And I think that, Florence was probably a little bit opportunistic and realized that if she was going to go anywhere, and Bram was certainly on the fast track, and he was headed to London with Irving, that's the way to go. And she jumped on that train, and they had a good life together. She did apparently get on stage at least once, and apparently that didn't go as well planned. So she then was happy being the mother to young Noel and being the dutiful wife. And funny enough, struck up a great relationship with Bram's brother, my great grandfather George, who Bram was working so hard at the theater at Lyceum all day long, and George was studying to be a doctor, and then a doctor, and he lived with them. Yeah. And so Florence would go with George to watch the plays when Bram was obviously backstage the whole time taking care of operations.
And Dacre, how old would you have been when you kind of realised, the family you were from?
Rita, I'm embarrassed to say, I remember as a sort of a teenager, my father mentioning, that this is who we're related to. Maybe I was 13, 14. And then it wasn't until the mid-70s, so I was sort of 16, 17, 18, when I think the world, because of McNally and Florescu writing this book In Search of Dracula, that the popular culture world really took notice that Bram Stoker was the man that did the research. Mm-hmm. And the research was then found in the Rosenbach Museum, his notes, and everything sort of came together for popular culture and the Stoker family when we got better access to these notes and understanding of what Bram did. And then I was in university a few years later and actually had to write a paper about an author, and I chose to sort of delve into Bram. Yeah. And so, sort of 18 or 19 years old was when I really was first introduced and sort of, as they say, sink my teeth into this thing.
What would have been inspirations for the story of Dracula?
Well, there was plenty of them, Rita. Many, and I actually usually touch on about 14 of them when I do these long, hour-long lectures, so I'll just give you a couple. But first of all, my feeling is that his own life had some tragedies in it that I mentioned earlier, the childhood illness, the sort of dealing with death at a young age, but also, his research into all these different roles that were to be played in the theater, the research for the Lyceum Theater, the sets and the understanding how the dialects were supposed to be used by the actors and actresses. So he was a research sort of, maniac that really did a wonderful job in this role of elevating the role of the theater. So as he was researching about things like Hamlet and Mephistopheles, these plays that they were putting on, that Bram would have stumbled across and found all this information about vampires in early literature, 15th, 16th century. And so that would have been the basis, him finding that. But then these parallels, I believe, when he found and understood what people in Eastern Europe were thinking about, yet again, a communicable disease, the plague, and the parallels between that and the cholera, all those things sort of blended together and became sort of what I call sort of what we have an aha moment, that Bram is like, here's this mythological vampires, but here are these real worries that people were having and drawing parallels between truth and fiction. Well, that's theater. Yeah. It's blending truth and fiction. Well, Bram does that same thing in the novel. And so many things about Dracula were real places, real events, real people, blending truth and fiction together so the lines are blurry. So his novel Dracula did that more than the other ones, some of the others he wrote, which were purely fictional. And so I believe this is sort of his magnum opus that blended his life, his own life, his research, and his showmanship or his theatership together to make people believe that maybe these events were based on real things. Maybe there's some reality to it, which is what Gothic literature at that time was all about.
And then there's so much about vampires in Irish folklore as well.
Oh, of course. I mean, he didn't have to research very far. That's memory. Those are things his mom told him. And we all think, it's only in Transylvania. But no, in natural history, in the research I've done, we found lots of things about sort of the afterlife and vampires and banshees. There is incredible mysticism in wonderful tales of storytelling, which is very similar to the Eastern Europeans on how they passed on stories to sort of, elaborate and scare people at night times and things. Irish were the same. So, he didn't have to look very far to get the real essence of the whole thing.
What did you think of the 1992 movie Bram Stoker's Dracula with Anthony Hopkins?
Well, I like the movie, and I get a little tired when I hear at least scholarly people and popular culture fans go, it's nothing like the book. Well, nothing is ever like a good book, especially when you read a book and you have your own sense of the book. But, to me, a movie based on a book, even though Universal used the name Bram Stoker's Dracula to make it sound like Bram Stoker put his seal of approval, or the estate did, we didn't. But nonetheless, I like the movie. I've gotten to know the screenwriter Jim Hart very well. I've done presentations with Jim where he has explained why he turned the story into a love horror story. And I'm not one, again, that says, well, I didn't read the book and it was a love story to me, but I respect that when Jim Hart and Francis Ford Coppola read the book, to them there was a big element of love. And you have to be original when you do a movie. And so they decided to create something that hadn't been done before. And they did two things very important, Rita. One is they did create this lost love between Mina and Dracula. And that was, to me, they made it somewhat believable. But they also created, in the first 3 to 4 minutes, a believable reason why Vlad became a vampire.
Yeah.
Now, recently the movie Dracula Untold came out, where they based an hour-and-a-half movie on why Vlad became a vampire. And Jim did that in 4 minutes. And both of them were wonderfully entertaining. So I think it's great. I'm not one that says it's rubbish unless it stays exactly with the book. We've been reading the book for 117 years. Let's see something original come out of it. And I liked it.
And then you joined forces with Ian Holt to write a sequel to Dracula called Dracula the Undead. How did that come about?
I'm glad you asked that because, again, we took some liberties to create something a little bit original. Ian had, I think, a very original idea. He had got to know McNally and Florescu back in the 80s, and he wanted to do a screenplay of their In Search of Dracula. He was a screenwriter, and apparently he did that, but nobody wanted to buy it. So he had this screenplay sort of gathering dust on his shelf, and it was a story of who the real Vlad was, and him telling his own side of the story, how Vlad was a fighter for Christianity against the Ottoman Empire, even though he was, yes, a ruthless leader and impaled people and so on, that he had to tell why he did that. He was vastly outnumbered. He had to rule by terror, which is not that unusual in these days and ages, even to this day, where people have to strike fear into their constituents to get things done. But in those days, that was commonplace. So Ian had this play, and he said, it's not going anywhere, but I really want a member of the Stoker family to help me turn this into a sequel to Dracula. There had been a few sequels, but nothing like this before. And he asked me if I could get access to any other notes that we may have that Bram had written. He said I needed to go to the Rosenbach Museum and look at those notes, which I did. And so, to make a long story short, he had this concept. I had these ideas that came out of the notes. Neither of us had written a book before, but it took us about 5 years to muddle through it, and we did have to hire an editorial service and a researcher to place the book in the right time frame and in the same kind of realistic conditions that Bram put his story. And so we decided to continue the story, but have a 25-year gap, because we wanted the young baby born at the end of Dracula to be old enough to carry a story. So the principal character is Quincy, the young baby born out of Mina. And we wanted him to then ask the question to his parents, and of course then make the readers find out what happened 25 years ago and why was there so much sort of friction between the remaining band of heroes that rid the world of Dracula 25 years ago. And of course, this goes on, and the subject has to be discussed of, was Dracula really killed at the end of Dracula? And of course, we take on that he wasn't, because there was only a Bowie knife that was thrust into the heart of Dracula and a knife cutting his throat. There was no wooden stake driven into Dracula's heart.
Yeah.
So he really wasn't killed in Bram's own novel by Bram's own technique. So, of course, we open up the doors that maybe he can live, and if he did, what would happen 25 years later?
And how did the rest of the Stoker family feel about a sequel being wrote?
Well, I thought it was going to be harder to find all the members of the family. And first of all, it wasn't, because Bram's family only had, of 7 children, only 3 had offspring, and not many of them were all that prolific. And so it wasn't that difficult, but it started my wife, who's a brilliant genealogist, and things like Ancestry.com and FindMyIrishPast.ie to help me dig around and find them all. And when I sent them a synopsis of the story, they said, well, that's wonderful, and maybe we've got some more information for you. None of them had been all that interested about it. Even his great-grandsons, who were wonderful guys and carried the banner a little bit, they thought, good for you. You know, a member of the family should have a say in it, but they weren't really sticky or stodgy about the style of the writing or the content of the writing. They just thought it was great that a member of the family was back in the fold, so to speak.
Oh, that's fantastic. And before you go, I just want to ask you, wasn't there a lot of trouble about copyright with Dracula? What was the story there?
Oh, yeah, it's a little complicated because every country in the world, and even in the United States, every state has different rules about copyright. But it was very complicated way back at the turn of the century. And for foreign writers to have a book copyrighted in America, they had to jump through all sorts of hoops and have the book literally serialized. So they had to be published in a newspaper for free prior to actually selling the book as a whole.
Oh my God.
Bram had that done, but then there's certain legends that or myths that I've been unable to find answers to. And I've gone to Library of Congress and I've asked them questions, and I keep getting circles about, did Bram actually present the 2 copies of his book to Library of Congress to secure the copyright, or was the American publisher, pulling a fast one? I don't have the exact answer, but I know that the family did get royalties up until 1962 from many different books around the world. We know that the screenplay rights were sold, but the people in Germany, Nosferatu, did lose the court case against Florence. So there's a lot of muckety-muck about both the copyrights and trademarks in the movies, and nobody has an absolutely straight answer because Universal won't show us the contract, and the American publisher doesn't want to disclose too much, and the Library of Congress, it's long ago forgotten. So it'll be one of those secrets that will probably remain a secret or a good story for years to come, Rita.
Well, Dacre, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show today. It's been such a pleasure talking to you.
Well, it's been a real pleasure, and I hope the show gets plenty of listeners, and we'd love to be back to Dublin sometime soon. I love the city. I love coming there and doing my research. It's very inspirational. Bye for now.